The next item of business is debate on motion 19715 in the name of Jamie Green on the resilience of Scotland's ferry network. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Jamie Green to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll start by moving the motion in my name. The reality is that Scotland's ferry service is under tremendous pressure. There is no doubt about that. And that pressure disproportionately affects and impacts our island communities, its businesses, its residents and also its visitors. And we spent a lot of time already in this chamber discussing the political ramifications of who owns what, or indeed who should own what. But I don't see any value in rehashing those arguments in today's debate. I brought this debate to the chamber today instead because we are fast approaching winter, when the resilience of Scotland's ferries will be pushed to its very limits. And I make no apologies for doing so, Presiding Officer. I make no apologies for using parliamentary time to bang on about the ferries again, because quite frankly, somebody has to. And judging by the volume of correspondence that I get, like probably so many others across the political spectrum, connectivity to our islands is arguably the #1 thing on people's lips when you visit an island community. So let me paint a picture of where we are at the moment. And as well as the statistics involved, there are many, let us also paint a picture of the human aspect to this debate, which is often lost when we talk about funding, strategies and reports. To date, delays and cancellations accumulate to over 82,000 in number since 2007. And over the course of the past 12 years, the numbers speak for themselves. The number of delays and cancellations on our ferry network have skyrocketed. In the year 2009-10, there were 1,800 cancellations of services per year across the CalMac network, all of them regrettable. But last year that number had risen to over 4,400, an increase of 130%, Presiding Officer. In the year 2009-10, the number of delays on that network were numbering 2,000 per year. Again, regrettable, but last year that number had risen to 5,500 delays, an increase of 160%. The reality is that since this government took office, there have been over 43,000 cancellations and 39,000 delays. If it's quite brief, you'll have an opportunity to speak after me.
Paul Wheelhouse.
Sorry. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I look forward to you giving me the opportunity to speak later. Mr Green mentioned statistics. Has he not recognised in the amendment that I've moved today, or will be moving today, that the latest figures, he's talking about last year, there's been significant improvement in reliability over the last 12 months, and it'd be nice if Mr Green would acknowledge that. Just 0.67% of ferry services have suffered cancellation through technical failure this year.
Jamie Green.
The Minister has chosen a very small number of cancellations that were due to mechanical breakdown. And I'm going to come on to your amendment in a moment, because I think it misses the point. What you're trying to say, in other words, is that 99.4% of cancellations are weather-related. I presume that is the point that you're making. Now, I don't know if that's an accurate number or not, and I'm sure when you're speaking you can clarify that. I need to make some progress to my points here. What you're missing, by looking at 9 months, you're painting a very small picture. I'm looking at the last decade. I'm talking about the last 12 years since when you came to power, because that's what people are really worried about. Now, I'd like to briefly mention Labour's amendment, because I think they make some valid points. The important point that I want to pick out from Labour's amendment in this debate is they highlight the excellent work that the staff who work for our ferry services do. They're working in extremely difficult circumstances, and they're really making the best of the assets that are available to them, assets which frequently let them down as well as passengers. But Labour's amendment also makes an important point, and that's the importance of delivering the new vessels that were ordered, vessels 801 and 802. Now, when we asked in the Rural Economy Committee if the late arrival of these vessels would have a knock-on effect on the fleet resilience, the answer is simple. Yes. There's no mention of that in Mr Wheelhouse's amendment. So I say to the Minister, when he responds to my comments, can he explain to Parliament why Derek Mackay's promise of a detailed plan on the revised timetable and costings for delivery of these vessels, which he promised would be with us, with his Parliament, by the end of October, not only has it not materialised, but no reason has been given for its absence. In fact, in response to the debate today, the Government seeks to amend my motion by doing the following. It seeks to simply delete it and replace it, and it says there's nothing to see here. We're doing a great job. There isn't a problem here. The government's defence, as the Minister said, that a small proportion of cancellations were avoidable, misses the point. 10 years ago, the number of cancellations on the Ardrossan to Brodick route were numbered at 86 per year. Last year, that was 328. You tell me that is the sign of success and a good service. But on the Loch Ranza service, that number was 160 to 215 in the same period. Is the weather really that different on one side of Arran as it is on another? The problem is that when the weather becomes an issue, our vessels and our docks are not geared up for these weather events. An ageing fleet means that those vessels need more maintenance than newer vessels. It means when they need maintenance, they have to go offline. It means vessel replacement. It means taking one ship from one route and putting it onto another. This isn't simply about mechanical breakdown. This is about the much wider effect that an ageing fleet has. But the Minister knows we have a problem. He knows that the status quo is not okay to our islanders, and he must know how unhappy people are about the unreliability of its fleet. If he doesn't know, he's either not asking or he's not listening. I said I'd mention the human aspect of this, and I will briefly do so. I was written to by an elderly resident on Arran who said the following: due to the unreliable status of this ferry, it means that I need to make that crossing to get to the hospital at least a day early, sometimes two days earlier than his appointment is due. Another wrote and said, we're fed up with this service. Unreliability makes it harder to attract and retain talent that our islands need, and it hampers our economic growth. Their words, not mine. And even CalMac's former managing director himself said that we do not have fleet resilience, and a breakdown will have a knock-on effect on the rest of the fleet. The government has known for years that new ferries were needed. So I ask simply, where are they, Minister? I challenge the centre benches. When you rise to speak in this debate, will you accept the government's amendment, which simply deletes my motions, makes excuses, apologises for nothing, and buries their head in the sand? Or will you be sticking up for your constituents? Or are you sticking up for your front bench? I know who we're sticking up for, and it's about time they did the same.
I now call on Paul Wheelhouse to speak to and move Amendment 19715.3 for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government understands the importance of safe and reliable ferry services to meet the needs of our remote and island communities. Those lifeline ferry services are critical to the continued socio-economic development of our island communities. And as I previously indicated in this Parliament, as set out in the proposed National Islands Plan, we remain committed to improving our ferry services and those issues which matter most to the businesses and communities who rely upon them, i.e. service quality and reliability. I've undertaken a considerable number of meetings with stakeholders over the last year, so I am far from complacent in respect of further improving the reliability and punctuality of Scotland-supported ferry services. However, that being said, it is important to record that performance has already improved. The actual reliability of all CalMac sailings for this period, January to September 2019, which also takes into account weather disruption, is 97%, which is an improvement of 0.5 percentage points when compared with the same period last year. The actual reliability of all Northlink ferries sailing over the same period is over 98.1%, an improvement of 0.4 percentage points compared to the same period in 2018. And as my amendment made clear, just 873 out of 130,184 sailings were affected by technical issues, or just 0.67% in the last year. And while the hard work and dedication of the staff and crew of CalMac and Northlink ferries are key in delivering these reliability improvements, the continued support of the Scottish Government has also been a factor. In August 2018, we announced a £3.5 million resilience fund to reduce the risk of vessels in the Clyde and Hebrides ferry services breaking down. A further £4 million was announced in the 2019-20 budget, and the funds are and will continue to be used to upgrade or replace key systems and equipment on vessels to improve the resilience of the fleet, with works undertaken as part of the annual maintenance programme. Despite real terms funding reductions by UK Government, the Scottish Government has invested over £2 billion in the Clyde and Hebrides ferry services, Northern Isles ferry services and ferry infrastructure since 2007. And that includes investment of almost £1.7 billion in operational costs, over £116 million associated with piers and harbours infrastructure, and £7.5 million for upgrades and resilience of vessels. And ferries with a capital value of over £255 million have been secured for service across Scotland. This investment also includes the rollout of significantly reduced fares through the road equivalent tariff scheme. 8 new vessels have been introduced to the CalMac fleet since 2007, plus a further 2 in construction. There has been significant recent investment to secure long-term use of the 3 RoPax passenger vessels and the 2 freighters for continued operation in Northern Isles ferry services, and of the MV Loch Seaforth for continued operation on the Stornoway-Ullapool route. The Scottish Government's budget for 2019-20 ensures continued support for subsidised ferry services across Scotland's islands, and capital funds are allocated in the budget to support the continued construction of the MV Glen Sannox and Hull 802. Allocation has also been made in the budget for Skye Triangle and Ardrossan port projects, and as part of that we have recently approved investment by Transport Scotland and CMAL of £15 million in the harbour upgrade at Tarbert and Harris. However, we cannot be complacent. My colleagues on these benches and I acknowledge the huge frustration experienced by passengers when services are not reliable or do not match demand, even when experienced in the context of the wider success of the operators. Presiding Officer, 5 of the last 6 orders for those new vessels have been awarded to Scottish yards. This government sees the contribution that ferries make to our supply chain and to securing growth in our maritime economy. And all 5 of those Scottish-built vessels deploy hybrid and dual-fuel technologies to reduce harmful emissions, making an important contribution to our overarching strategy to reduce emissions. The Scottish Government has continued to support vessel investment and the commercial shipbuilding sector in Scotland through the construction of the MV Glen Sannox and Hull 802 at Ferguson's, and through public ownership of the yard, a move that is supported by Presiding Officer. We have achieved much, but we must continue to look forward and to build on our investment to date. We have a strategic investment programme which we will keep under review. Investments such as for Isla is being made in accordance with the published vessel replacement and deployment plan, and the next version of that plan is currently in final drafting. It will take into account findings emerging from the Outer Hebrides, Mallaig, Armadale and Craigmuir Stags, with the final report due to be published later this year. And in particular, this will have to reflect the huge success of road equivalent tariff and its impact on passenger demand on some routes. The next ferries plan will be taken forward following the finalisation of a national transport strategy in parallel with the Strategic Transport Project Review, which will also consider other potential viable options for connecting our islands. That work is being jointly taken forward by Transport Scotland, CMAL and CalMac, and as I previously indicated, we will also work in close consultation with key businesses and community stakeholders. We'll engage with the trade unions to reflect the operational impact of any proposals in staff and crew, and these are quite properly long-term measures. Given the scale of investment, it's important that we take an informed, strategic and balanced approach. I will say more in my closing remarks, Presiding Officer, but just to say that I move the amendment in my name and I look forward to the debate ahead. Thank you very much.
I call Colin Smith to speak to and move amendment 19715.2. Mr Smith, up to 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, we can't overstate the importance of Scotland's ferry network to our island communities. Last year, the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee carried out a budget scrutiny process on investment to support the Clyde and Hebrides ferry services. In their evidence to the committee, Western Isles Council described their ferry links as central to the sustainability and well-being of the island communities. Argyll and Bute Council said the network is the very means to survive and prosper. That survival is therefore under threat by the type of disruption many of our island communities have suffered in recent years, caused by the lack of capacity and resilience on many of our routes reliant on an over-aging fleet. Over half of CMAL's fleet is now more than 20 years old. More than a quarter is older than 30 years. This not only impacts on reliability, but has caused maintenance costs to skyrocket by more than 150% over the last 10 years. And that means more vessels are being withdrawn for longer for extra maintenance, a point ignored in the Government's amendment today. This winter, CalMac alone are planning £9 million worth of extra maintenance on the Clyde and Hebrides network, in addition to their ongoing maintenance schedule, just to keep the fleet afloat and try to make it more resilient. Presiding Officer, every year more and more money is needed to mitigate the risk of a fleet that is too old and simply not fit for purpose, and being kept going by the at times heroic efforts of staff on the ferries and in our ports. Money that could have been saved with a more proactive strategic approach to vessel replacement. In 2017, Audit Scotland concluded there is no Scotland-wide long-term strategy. 10 years ago, the then Transport, Infrastructure and Climate Change Committee called on the Scottish Government to produce a national ferry strategy that would detail long-term plans for routes, for ferry replacement, for refurbishment, for port infrastructure, accompanied by an implementation and delivery plan with a clear programme of funding. But that has still not been delivered. We need that proper long-term ferry strategy more than ever to deliver the comprehensive strategic planning for our fleet, setting out a regular programme of replacement. That will not only improve the reliability of the ferry network, it will benefit Scotland's shipbuilding sector, a sector whose jobs remain crucial to the Scottish economy. A real strategy for ferry replacement, setting out a clear programme of work, would help provide certainty for the shipbuilding sector, allowing them to invest in their yards, create jobs and develop and maintain vital skills and expertise. This steady drumbeat of consistent work would not only allow yards to invest, but also improve efficiency and deliver better value for the public purse. So Labour welcomes the recent decision to save Ferguson's Marine to protect the yard's future and the vital jobs it provides. But we still haven't seen any schedule from the government showing when the 2 new ferries being built there will be completed, and we need to be clear about the actions and the lack of earlier intervention that put these jobs at risk in the first place. The Ferguson's Marine workforce have been working tirelessly to deliver these new ferries under incredibly difficult circumstances. Their work and expertise should not be overshadowed by events they have no control over. That workforce want to see these ferries delivered as much as the communities they will ultimately serve, and they, more than anyone, want a long-term vision for shipbuilding. And, Presiding Officer, in concluding, it's clear that the lack of resilience and capacity, particularly at peak times on particular routes, are a barrier for our island communities. It prevents islanders accessing healthcare, employment, education and more. And the failure to have a programme of more regular ferry replacement is undermining our shipyards. More than ever, we need a modern ferry network that properly meets the needs of Scotland's island communities, and we need a strong shipbuilding sector to protect the jobs so important to our economy. It's time for the Scottish Government to deliver both. I therefore move the amendment in my name.
I call John Finney for 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, it's the role of government to provide the long-term strategy for continuing to meet the needs of the communities that rely on ferry services. Not my words, the words of CalMac in their submission to the REC Committee. They also told us in that specific answer that between 2012 and 2017, the number of cars carried had grown by 37% to 1.43 million per year, and passenger numbers had risen by 17% to 5.2 million per year. Now, in the very same answer, they said, and I quote here, despite many trust, local authority or privately owned ports to which CalMac operates accruing millions of pounds in berthing duties, it's not clear how this income has been reinvested in ports. And that's very important because, of course, Mr Green, excuse me, forgive me, used the term our dogs. This is a very complicated situation. And I get that how you want to have a slagging about the whole approach over a lengthy period, and I get how the government wants to say everything is as positive as it can be. I have to say, I have to pull you up in something else when you said they were unwilling to apologise, when it's very explicit in their motion that they do acknowledge the inconveniences here. But I also want to pick up on something that I think my colleague Colin Smith said there, and this is something else from CalMac. It's impossible to overstate the importance of lifeline ferry services to the long-term economic sustainability of remote and vulnerable island communities. These are communities I represent, and I'm very proud to represent. And I have to tell you, it won't surprise you that in recent months I've used ferries on a number of occasions, on each occasion perfectly on time, courteous staff, very, very efficient. Now,
can I interrupt you, please, Mr Finney? Can I say this is not a private conversation between two people? Can you please speak through the chair?
I'll address all my remarks exclusively to you, Presiding Officer. Thank you very much, because I know... Yeah. OK, so the question of this, suddenly this being an issue from 2007, and I wonder why that year might have been picked, is very peculiar to my mind. Because also in the REC Committee budget report, we heard very clearly, and I see Mr Cameron shaking his head, and I'll tell you, I don't think he would take issue with what Highlands and Islands Transport Partnership told us. And they noted that there had been no new major ferries entered service between 2001 and 2011. Now, we know the age and profile of the fleet. That's already I beg your pardon for averting my eyes, Presiding Officer. We know how important that is. We know that, as with anything, whether that's a motor vehicle, a pedal cycle, the longer you have it, the repairs and all the rest. But the run-in time to these is not something that suddenly appeared. There has been neglect over a number of decades, and that's manifesting itself now. And it's manifesting itself with the Glensannox, the 802, which are desperately needed, desperately needed. And for that reason, you know, the economic reality is a fact. And again, the mention in the government motion of a reduction in funding is entirely appropriate. The Scottish Green Party would have different manifesto will have different manifesto and does have different transport priorities, and they wouldn't be about £6 billion in 2 roads. They would be ensuring that public services are properly funded, and that includes our lifeline ferry services. So I absolutely wish to commend the Scottish Government, not on the overall approach, but on some of the things they have done, not least the RET, not least the taking the yard into public ownership. We are a maritime nation. We will rely on a number of ferries to be replaced. I want Scotland to be known as a location which makes quality ferries, perhaps rather than warships. We've a long way to go with that. That's not just exclusively the fleets that the Scottish Government has responsible for, also the internal services in Orkney and Shetland. There's opportunities there. We are a maritime nation, as I say. There needs to be innovation in this. I regret that the public service ethos isn't follow itself to the Northern Isles contract, because I don't think Serco should have opportunity for that. Is everything great? No. Is everything awful? No. Thank you. We'll be supporting the Labour amendment.
I'm sure you two can carry on that conversation over a coffee later. And now call Liam MacArthur for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I start by thanking Jamie Green for bringing this debate to Parliament. He's right that somebody does need to bang on about ferries, and I take considerable pride in having been that someone. I cannot think of any issue that I've raised more frequently with ministers and indeed with the First Minister since being elected in 2007. And I certainly recognise the public concerns referred to in the motion, not just in relation to the problems caused to individuals and businesses and communities in our islands and coastal areas from disruption to lifeline ferry services, but looking further ahead to the growing concerns about what appears to be a lack of resilience in Scotland's ferry network as a result of an ageing fleet. And Mr Green and Colin Smith and others have understandably focused more of their remarks on what is happening on the West Coast and indeed in relation to the fallout over the future of Ferguson's Yard. But I can assure the Chamber that the concerns being highlighted here today and which the Minister seems to have airbrushed out through his amendment are very much shared by the communities that I represent in Orkney. The Minister will know that the internal ferry services in Orkney already, no, you'll have time to respond later, already fall well below the minimum standards set out in the Government's own National Ferries Plan. In terms of cost, frequency, accessibility, across a range of measures, the North and South Isles in Orkney are getting a raw deal when it comes to the quality of the internal ferry services upon which they depend. As for the vessels themselves, most are now desperately in need of replacement. The Minister knows this. It's a message I have been reinforcing with him and his predecessors for some time, as indeed have successive administrations at Orkney Islands Council. I've lost track of how many stag appraisals have been carried out since I was first elected. Each appraisal only serves to highlight the increasingly urgent need for new vessels, yet still there is no plan in place or agreement from the Government to help meet the cost of vessels that are crucial to the future viability of some of our most fragile island communities. This is despite bold promises made by the former Transport and Islands Minister during the passage of the Islands Act last year. At the time, Mr Youssef told us to await publication of the National Islands Plan to see the detail of the Government's commitment on lifeline ferry services. When the draft plan was finally published last month, however, there was little to offer reassurance to people and businesses in Orkney. No sign that ministers were preparing to deliver on those promises. No recognition of the responsibility to help deliver a level of service in line with the standards set out in the Government's own ferries plan. Deputy Presiding Officer, that is simply not good enough. It is a failure that leaves island communities in Orkney less resilient and more vulnerable. It's a failure that puts island businesses at a competitive disadvantage at a time when they're already having to deal with plenty of uncertainty. And it's a failure that forces crew members to do their best with resources that are patently not fit for purpose. Little wonder the Islands Plan was described by the leader of Orkney Islands Council as, quote, very disappointing, a missed opportunity and without any real substance. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government needs to face up to its responsibilities in relation to the replacement of Orkney's internal ferry fleet. It needs to stop shortchanging Orkney and help ensure the level of service meets at least the minimum standards set out in its own ferries plan. And it needs to stop putting down amendments that gloss over these concerns and paint a picture that everything is rosy when it comes to Scotland's ferry network. Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the motion this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Open debate, 4-minute speeches, but there is time for interventions. I call Liam Kerr to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this debate, but I'm disappointed by the failure of the SNP to acknowledge that there are issues, as evidenced principally by their amendment and the Minister's contribution earlier. The Minister says we cannot be complacent, yet Liam MacArthur is absolutely right. There is the usual nothing to see here gloss, with the SNP effectively telling island communities, their inhabitants, businesses and tourism that there is no problem and no scope to improve. But there are challenges. In 2018, the Public Audit Committee took evidence on Audit Scotland's report on Scotland's ferry services. We discovered that in 2016-17, Transport Scotland spent £209.7 million on ferry services and assets, a sizable figure which, to be fair, had increased by 115% over 10 years, for an increase in passengers of 0.3%. But at least there's a strategy, right? Wrong. Because Audit Scotland say there is no Scotland-wide long-term strategy, with the result that, in the context of limited public finances, Transport Scotland will find it challenging to continue to provide ferry services that meet the needs of users within its allocated budget. Perhaps the Minister will outline in closing whether his intention is to increase fares, reduce services or cut back on capital spending in light of that conclusion. But at least we can demonstrate empirically that island communities are getting the benefits. Oh wait, no we can't, because, quote, Transport Scotland does not routinely measure the contribution that ferry services make to social and economic outcomes, which makes it difficult to determine whether its spending is value for money. But at least we can be reassured that the tendering process is robust. Well, no, because on the Clyde and Hebrides ferry service, Audit Scotland tell us that 2 tenderers submitted over 800 queries, and CalMac's bid has 350 commitments, the achievement of which cannot be assessed. And of course, right after that contract was awarded, the successful contract increased in price by over 100 million, such that between 2007 and 17, the subsidies on the CHFS contract went up by 185%. Now, issues like these must raise serious questions about the SNP's ability to deliver ferry services, and I think reveal a cavalier attitude to spending taxpayers' cash with little or no regard to value for money. Now, here's why I want to flag this, because I recall travelling several times on the Gourock to Dunoon route with Western Ferries. These are ferries which have seen low cancellations, only 6 this year on 27,000 sailings. They are car ferries, which may have contributed to the 17% increase in cars transported since 2007 and a 1% increase in passenger numbers. And this year they've crossed 30 blue light emergency vehicles. Except, this is not a record the SNP can take credit for, because this company, employing predominantly local people and transporting local vehicles, did not receive a penny in subsidy, unlike the state-owned competitor, Argyll Ferries, which, according to Audit Scotland, had a 148% increase in subsidy and doesn't carry vehicles. And there is the Circle North link that the Minister brought up. In my personal view, and I echo the Minister here, a well-run, efficient service with lots of local produce from the North East and the islands, which is to the benefit of our communities. And I think a 20% passenger increase since 2013. Yet whilst the years between 2011 and 16 saw massive increases in subsidy to state providers, support to Northlink reduced by more than a third. Presiding Officer, where this gets us to is this. John Finney is absolutely right. It is not easy to run a ferry service. But if the state is going to run services, we cannot ignore the challenges of the tendering process, the issues which make running those services difficult, the lack of monitoring and defined outcomes and considerations of value for money. The SNP's constant pretense that all is well does a disservice to passengers, to businesses, and Liam MacArthur is absolutely right. The workers doing their absolute best to provide these absolutely vital, valuable and iconic lifeline services. The SNP have been in charge for over 12 years. It's time to stand aside and let someone competent take over.
I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. Mr Gibson, please.
Presiding Officer, even Liam Kerr smiled at his last comment. 9 days ago, I met with CalMac Managing Director Robbie Drummond and Brian Fulton, the Director of Community and Stakeholder Engagement, to discuss all matters ferry-related, and they provided an excellent document which, contrary to the Tory moanfest we heard earlier, pointed to the steady progress being made by CalMac in recent years to deliver Clyde and Hebridean ferry services and to Arran specifically, and the work of their staff in achieving this is of course to be particularly commended. For example, since the SNP government introduced road equivalent tariff, reducing the cost of taking a car to Arran by 64%, there's been a surge in demand with a 66% increase in cars travelling and 25% increase in passengers, helping to boost the Arran economy and creating sustained jobs. Some 847,428 passengers and 204,451 cars travelled to the island last year alone. A more efficient use of capacity and an increased number of summer sailings this season have been extended from just a few weeks, which we inherited from Labour and the Lib Dems, to more than half a year, has also been accompanied by a 29% increase in scheduled sailings over the last 8 years. Breakdowns to and from Arran were 0.5% due to technical breakdown in 2017-18. That's 1 in 200, and 2.8% of all sailings were also affected by inclement weather. I mean, one wonders what aviation numbers in terms of delays and cancellations would be by comparison. Of course, whether going to a hospital appointment, shopping on the mainland, if you're an islander, or just visiting friends, passengers understandably recall the sailing that was cancelled, and every effort therefore must be maintained in reducing cancellations further. A £3.5 million resilience fund established last year has increased to £4 million and should make further improvements. And this government has also invested massively in 8 new vessels, £255 million, with a £12.6 million MV Katrina having entered service in September 2016 on the Lachranza to Clonig route. A modern Brodick port having been developed, representing an investment over £30 million, and a new £35.6 million Ardrossan Harbour redevelopment to begin on site next year. This will improve resilience, the passenger experience, and result in fewer disruptions. Does anyone seriously expect us to believe that the Tories, who've cut billions in capital from Scotland's budget, would have done more for Arran, Cumbria, or any other Scottish island? And at CalMac, customer communication is improving with a 92% customer satisfaction rating. A new ticketing system planned for 2021 will improve the experience further, and an integrated operations control centre was established to provide customers with more detailed and timely information. Indeed, CalMac's contact centre was awarded a CCA Global 7 award for customer service, the only company anywhere in the world to achieve this accolade. And recently, of course, we had the blink-span breakdowns at Ardrossan and Gurrit, which I questioned the Minister on. These are a direct result of underinvestment by Peel Ports and infrastructure in the 2.5 decades since privatisation by the Tories, of course. Challenges do lie ahead. Whilst I'm delighted that the next ferries plan will be taken forward following the finalisation of the National Transport Strategy and in parallel with the Strategic Transport Projects Review, renewal of the fleet is indeed urgent. Vessels are ageing with 8 more than 30 years old, although it should be pointed out that 2 Lib Dem transport ministers in the coalition did absolutely nothing whatsoever to build any vessels. I would urge, for reasons of reliability, flexibility and cost, that the Scottish Government give consideration to a sustained construction programme with only 2 or at most 3 types of vessel, rather than the cost of delay which we see when every vessel is uniquely designed to suit only 1 or 2 more ports. Presiding Officer will take no lectures from the Tory transport spokesperson, who in 2016 laid down a parliamentary motion calling for the retention of the non-existent Ardrossan to Troon ferry service, and would appear to want Ferguson Marine shut rather than in public hands, regardless of the employment. And if you look at the 2nd of May Times, it reported that Chris Grayling, the Tory UK Transport Secretary, wasted £83 million on non-existent transport policies.
There you must conclude, Mr Gibson. Thank you very much. I call Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We're dependent on our ferry links in the Northern Isles, and I've used these since I was a child, and we've seen different operators come and go, some areas of improvement, but also services coming under increasing pressure. I want to focus today on the public supported services in Orkney and Shetland, the Northern Isles ferry service operated by Northlink, and the inter-island internal ferries operated by Orkney and Shetland Islands councils within their areas. And I'd like to turn first to the internal ferries. As early as 2012, the Scottish Government said that they recognise the unfairness of the situation where costs fell to the local authorities. By summer 2014, then First Minister Alex Salmond was trying to win support in the Northern Isles in the middle of that year's referendum, telling all who would listen that the SNP would bring about fair funding in the provision of ferries and ferry infrastructure. 2 years later, in 2016, a working group was finally established to actually consider how to deliver that promised fair funding, work that should have been done years before. Meanwhile, island representatives were working together, relentlessly pressing ministers, but in response, the Scottish Government obfuscated. They quibbled, and until eventually able to bluster no more and under the weight of pressure from island politicians of all political colours, the SNP government delivered a one-off payment to both councils. However, that wasn't the long-term sustainable commitment the islands needed, and the figure settled on then, which met the financial asks of the councils then, does not meet the needs of those services now. So we're left in the position of the islands' councils forced to make the case year after year to be allocated the fair funding settlement the Scottish Government and SNP candidates at election after election promised so many years ago. And this is despite our Islands Our Future campaign, which resulted in the Islands Act being passed by this Parliament. It required the creation of a national islands plan by the Scottish Government. But despite its lengthy discussions about fairness and parity, there was not a single commitment to be found on fair funding of these vital lifeline ferry services. The current instability and uncertainty over the future settlement is causing real concern in our islands, and that's before we talk about the impending need to replace vessels, as Liam MacArthur highlighted. And if I can now focus on the Northern Isles services, the main services connecting Orkney and Shetland with the Scottish mainland. Again, it's a story of promises made again and again, then delayed again. We were promised lower fares by the Scottish Government, but instead of being implemented in the middle of 2018 as promised, there was a piecemeal implementation for Shetland and nothing for Orkney. Now, you'll have a chance to respond later, Cabinet Secretary. The delay was blamed on issues around compliance with EU state rules, a case that would have been far more reasonable if ministers had engaged with the ferry operators at an earlier stage. Instead, we got a legal dispute. And we have recently seen the routes retendered, an opportunity to set the future direction of the service. Instead, we got a vague threat of nationalisation, something local people don't want, followed by a tendering process in which many of the issues that islanders are most concerned about, the cost and availability of cabins, reliability of the service, freight capacity and the availability of suitable replacements when boats are on refit, have not been addressed. Presiding Officer, if it seems like the Scottish Government are making it up as they go along, it's probably because they are. Because as Liam Kerr highlighted, we lack a real strategic view on the future of our ferries and how we connect our island communities, not just for now, but for years ahead. And without that, the Scottish Government's warm words around sustainability of island communities becomes meaningless. Scotland's ferries provide lifeline links with our island and other remote communities. They keep some of those communities sustainable. They make island life in the 21st century possible. But they have been neglected by an SNP administration without a comprehensive plan, one that is better at making promises to the islands than on delivering them.
Thank you. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Mr McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, just to remind the Chamber that my wife works part-time for Calmac. I'm going to touch upon the Scottish Government amendment, also cover part of the Labour amendment and also the Conservative motion in front of us. So it will come as no surprise that most of my comments will be focused upon Ferguson Marine and the issue of shipbuilding. Now, I fully support the actions of the Scottish Government in stepping in to save the yard. Make no mistake, the yard was going into administration, and the Scottish Government needed to step in to save the jobs, help my constituency, and also my community. But clearly also to save shipbuilding for the future, to complete the 2 Seamal vessels, as well as the other 3 vessels that are currently under construction. Out and about in my constituency, I get the same message from constituents, and that's thank you to the Scottish Government. Thank you for saving this shipyard. Now, the Tories are laughing, but if they don't want to save jobs, that's entirely up to the Tories. That's entirely up to the Tories if they don't want to save them. The yard was going to shut. Now, my constituents know that the Scottish Government stands up for them in comparison to the heartless Tories, whose record on shipbuilding, including in Inverclyde, is there for all to see. Yards were shut, thousands were paid off, people were forced to get on their bike to go and find employment, and also depopulation, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, Presiding Officer, Jamie Green in his contribution earlier, Jamie Green should know better, because he's from Inverclyde. But some of his public comments are quite bizarre, and also lack the local history that his party has actually inflicted upon the Inverclyde area. I'm going to give him just a couple of Mr Green's quotes. On the 10th of August, Mr Green, on the back of the Ferguson situation, Mr Green has commented as saying, the blame for this fiasco lies solely at the feet of the SNP government, who have recklessly mismanaged the contract.
No, I can't hear the quote, and neither can the official report. Please continue.
Okay, who have recklessly mismanaged the contract, wasted hundreds of millions of pounds, blah, blah, blah. And then he goes on to, on the 2nd of October, he goes on to say they are responsible for the mess the yard is in, and they should have let it flourish in the private sector. So when Mr Green is commenting later on, I mean, two key points there were reckless mismanaged the contract and should have let it flourish in the private sector. Can Mr Green later on actually tell the Chamber how, if the contract was mismanaged, if it was mismanaged, if it was in the private sector? How can the government do that if it's in the private sector? Secondly, if it was flourishing in the private sector, then how was the contract mismanaged? Now, I'd be keen to hear Mr Green's comments when he went, no, I've only got 4 minutes because you cut. Right, so I'm happy to hear Mr Green later on. It's not a problem at all. Inverclyde knows it's the Scottish Government that actually are standing up for the area, unlike the Tories, whose political legacy is not one to be cherished. Ferguson's is saved. Now, the Tories clearly don't want to hear that, but Ferguson's is saved. The yard is saved. The jobs are saved. The five vessels currently under construction are going to be finished, including those 2 Seamile vessels, Mr Green. And certainly I know that my constituents genuinely want Ferguson Shipyard to remain for many more years to come. I personally want to see a longer-term strategy to ensure they get the throughput of more vessels to be built at that yard. And I certainly do thank the GMB Union for their support in ensuring that this yard has been saved as well. I know that the workforce in that yard certainly do not trust the Tories. They never will trust the Tories, but they do thank the work that this Scottish Government have done to save their jobs. Thank you very much.
I now call Rhoda Grant to be followed by Alistair Allen. Mr Allen is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Grant.
The Government's record in providing ferry services has been abysmal. When the Loch Seaforth was built for the Stornoway-Ullapool route, the community wanted 2 smaller boats. This would enable more sailings in the summer and provide cover throughout the fleet in the winter for dry dock maintenance. Instead, the Government gave them 1 large vessel that does not provide sufficient capacity in the summer and sails half empty in the winter. The design also appears to be flawed in that the cooling system left the flagship floundering in the Minch this summer. A beautiful boat that can only berth in Stornoway, Ullapool or Oban, and therefore if there's a problem in Stornoway Harbour, it can't operate at all. The community view has been borne out to be right, and the Scottish Government's wrong. We have seen islands all but cut off with ferry breakdowns, and that's caused huge inconvenience to our island communities. The people in Barra gave up and held a ceilidh on the pier instead. There is not enough capacity in the system to deal with breakdowns or indeed routine maintenance, and this leads to inappropriate ferries on routes that they were not designed for, leading to more cancellations due to weather, because they can't cope. And this is especially a problem when there are winter weather conditions, and that's the time that most routine maintenance takes place. So that is why a lot of the cancellations are down to weather. We need boats that are fit for purpose on routes at that time of year. The Scottish Government brought in RET, another flagship policy, but did it without providing any additional capacity. And this means that the very policy that was put in place to help islanders has had the effect of shutting them out of ferries. People travelling at short notice can't get a place in the boat to make these journeys. People need to get to hospital, to visit sick relatives, and indeed to attend funerals, but they find themselves unable to travel. Port staff do their utmost to help, but most people are now routed through a centralised call centre, and then they don't get to speak direct to port staff. The ferries are old and therefore break down, and there is no additional capacity in the route for the summer. And someone needs to measure this unmet need. How can you plan ferry services for the future if you don't know what need is going unmet? Turning to the MV Glen Sannox and Hull 802, the government boast of in their amendment, but they're nearly 2 years overdue, and nowhere in the amendment is there a date for completion of those 2 ferries. And rumours abound about what has gone wrong. There needs to be an inquiry into this fiasco. However, if the rumours are to be believed, it is just another vanity project for this government. The design was not signed off and was subject to multiple changes. The fuel system was so innovative that it's rumoured to be highly inappropriate and doesn't even work for the short journeys involved for those ferries, and therefore will not provide the cut in carbon emissions sought. What on earth is going on? You couldn't make it up. It would appear these vanity projects mean that the Scottish taxpayer is paying much more than they need to for new ferries, and we desperately need new ferries. None of this comes down to the workforce at Ferguson's, a workforce whose expertise is world-renowned. It is down to the mismanagement of the Scottish Government. We now see delays in the Northern Isles ferries contract, and again the Scottish Government appears to have shut down the lowest bidder. And there are concerns also about capacity in the Northern Isles because they produce most of our fish, and a large amount of livestock means seasonal variations in freight needs. Is any of this being met? The cost of a cabin for a long journey to Shetland is also prohibitive. People need to be able to travel that distance and be comfortable. It shouldn't depend on their ability to pay. All our island communities want is ferries and ferry services that are fit for purpose and that meet their needs and are affordable.
Thank you. I call Alistair Allen, please.
Presiding Officer, as other speakers have said, it's impossible to underestimate the importance to my constituency and other island constituencies of ferries and the services they provide. Everything in the island economy in one way or another depends on these vessels. And no, not everything is as it should be or could be with our ferry services, but we have, over the course of the last decade, seen many improvements, and that is a fact about which Mr Green, I'm afraid, seemed to be unaware. As Mr Gibson said, the introduction of RET was revolutionary. We have come a long way from the days when Western Isles MP Donald Stewart stood as a lonely voice in the House of Commons advocating it. The present Scottish Government has doubled, in real terms, the amount of money being invested in ferry services, and this has been necessary to deal with a previous decade of chronic underinvestment, during which, as other speakers have pointed out, virtually no major vessels were built. However, there are challenges, and it would be remiss of me not to mention them. Compared with a decade ago, ferries to the Western Isles now deal with an astonishing 184,000 additional passenger journeys every year. The number of visitors that we now host in May, and this is a good thing, is typically what we would previously expect to see in July. It's also a fantastic tribute to the work that the tourist industry and many others have done in making the Western Isles a must-visit destination for a huge range of tourists. However, this obviously does put strain on the network, and it is predominantly islanders trying to get on and off the island at short notice who feel the effects of that strain. While people are able to live with this on a few busy weekends in the summer, it is asking too much for locals to accept this for the whole of the summer. It is very clear that we do need more capacity on routes to the Western Isles. We also need to listen to what islanders are saying about how to deal with capacity issues in the short term. Over the course of the summer, there have been calls for measures such as reserving space for islanders or introducing staggering bookings. And it is right that CalMac should explore the feasibility of introducing such measures. Now, meanwhile, the Minister will be aware that one of the major issues that came out of the UST Ferry Summit, which I hosted last year and which the Minister spoke at, was the urgent need for CalMac to overhaul their ageing booking system, which regularly shows vessels full when they are not. And I was encouraged to hear about progress on that front, so I'd be grateful for any further information from the Minister today. In the longer term, there are no easy solutions. However, the idea, a radical one I appreciate, that some of CalMac's routes could ultimately be replaced by tunnels is becoming a more realistic one, I believe, as time goes on. This is certainly not a cheap option, or certainly not one that's suitable for every route. However, no option looked at over the long term is going to be cheap, and so looking for lessons from other places, not least the Faroe Islands, is probably worth our while doing, and certainly it's worth our while having an open debate about it from time to time in this place. Ultimately, as I say, everyone agrees that more capacity is needed on island ferry routes. However, we should not be prepared to take lessons from the Conservative Party, whose interest in this subject is so fleeting that not a single mention of CalMac or indeed ferries was made in their most recent Holyrood manifesto. Indeed, a word search, and I accept it's only a word search, but a word search of all their recent manifestos produces only 2 mentions of ferries in recent Tory manifestos. I can see since devolution in 1999, and one of those mentions in 2011 was to speculate where savings might be made in the provision of services of ferries. So I think, Presiding Officer, that probably speaks for itself.
Thank you. I have a little time in hand, so all the closing speakers got an extra minute. So I call on Colin Smith to close for Labour. 5 minutes, Mr Smith.
Thank you very much, President Officer. Thank you for the advance warning. I'll think of extra things to say. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know.
I have to say, I've never found a politician who can't take an extra minute to speak.
What, 30 seconds gone already? This debate has at least in some contributions, recognised the frustrations of our island communities over the impact of the lack of capacity and resilience in Scotland's ageing ferry fleet. It's highlighted the desperate need for a long-term ferry building programme which detailed the Government's plans for fleet and port replacement and upgrades over the next 30 years or so. That plan needs to deliver a better, more reliable service for Scotland's island communities, and it must deliver certainty for the shipbuilding sector to secure the jobs and skills of our shipyards and their workforces. It's a strategic approach that has been sorely missing. As a result, we have an ageing fleet with vessels requiring more and more maintenance and a shipbuilding industry and workforce with no long-term view of their pipeline of work, and that desperately needs to change. Beyond delivering that badly needed ferries plans, it's clear there are also shortcomings in how the Government procures new ferries, with those failings exposed by the current delays in the delivery of the 2 new hybrid ferries we still don't have a schedule for when they will be completed, and in the decision to replace the MV Isle of Lewis with 1 large ship rather than 2 small vessels, as highlighted by Rhoda Grant. Rhoda Grant and Alistair Allen also highlighted the need to have a new approach to capacity management. It's not enough for ferries to run on time if people can't buy tickets to get on them. We need to end the situation where ferries are fully booked months in advance and become effectively closed off to local residents who rely on them. The introduction of road equivalent tariff fares on Clyde and Hebrides ferry services improved affordability and provided a welcome boost to passenger numbers. But this was not accompanied by the planning or investment needed to help meet this increased demand. The growing number of passengers travelling to the islands is positive, but it cannot come at the expense of the local communities who rely on these services. It's also not clear, more than 18 months after it was meant to be introduced, whether passengers on the Northern Isles ferry services will ever benefit from RET fares. But when or if they are introduced, we must ensure that the necessary capacity is put in place to meet increased demand. But, Presiding Officer, what this debate has really shown is the need to view our lifeline ferry services as a public service. And like all other public services, they need to be accessible. Labour believes those lifeline ferry services should also be in public ownership. On the Clyde and Hebrides routes, CalMac have provided value for money, and despite the clear challenges they face, they and their workforce deliver for our island communities on a daily basis. It's therefore disappointing that the Scottish Government decided against directly awarding the Northern Isles Ferry Services contract to a public sector operator. One of the consequences of the Government's approach is to fail to fully protect and enhance working conditions. During the current Northern Isles Ferry Services contract, the MV Arrow from Sea Truck Ferries Limited was chartered in order to meet growing freight demand on the route. As part of this, subcontracted staff were not only being paid less than the living wage, but being paid less than the national minimum wage. That simply must be prevented. I'll take an intervention on that.
Minister.
I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention. Just to point out that we have tried very hard with the operator and the owner of the vessel to try and change that, to even offer on a bespoke basis to pay the living wage. Unfortunately, that is not possible, and was deemed not possible by the operator, and we have additional difficulty that without devolution of employment law to Scotland, we cannot legislate to make that a requirement, but certainly keen to keep the member posted on that.
I listened to what the Minister's saying, but the reality is the Minister's just renewed that contract in order to continue effectively to have a lower standard of workers' rights for those people if any ferries are required to be subcontracted. And surely that should have been avoided when it came to awarding that particular contract. We should have ensured that the capacity was put in place to make sure you didn't have to subcontract these services because of growing freight demand on that particular route. And I have to say, I've asked the Minister on more than one occasion to give me a guarantee that all staff, including subcontractors, on the new Northern Islands ferry services will be covered by a collective bargaining agreement. And it seems from what he's saying today that that isn't the case. The Government are very keen to point out on numerous occasions that the Fair Work framework applies to these contracts, but we must be clear that that framework definitely needs strengthened because we are unable to guarantee collective bargaining for all the workforces, particularly those who are subcontracting. And that's an issue the Government really need to start to address when it comes to awarding these contracts. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I've used up my 5 minutes, so I will finish here, but we need action from the Government not only to improve how ferries are run by bringing lifeline services into public hands, but also in the way investment projects are planned, procured and managed by creating a long-term strategy for our ferries and the necessary ferry building plan to support that strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call on Paul Wheelhouse to close to the Government Minister. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start where I had to finish in my opening remarks, just in timing. Just to state that we are responding to short-term challenges that have arisen in terms of response and feedback from island communities. We put in place an action plan, not least influenced by a meeting I had with Mr Gibson and Mr Russell and local ferry committees, to better manage what ferry users can expect by way of customer service and information from the ferry operator when services are disrupted. And Transport Scotland will work together with ferry operators to get this right for passengers. Mr Gibson and indeed Dr Allen also raised the issue of the booking system. I think Mr Smith also referred to that in passing. Just to update members, the Transport Scotland are fully funding the replacement of the existing system. As part of that, Transport Scotland are in active discussion with CalMac to explore upgrades to bring it in line with broader smart ticketing policy aspirations. And CalMac has already started the procurement process with the issue of an overdue notice at the end of September. And following on from this, CalMac will be issuing an invitation to tender in the next few months, and it's expected that a preferred bidder will have been identified by summer 2020, and the project will subsequently be fully rolled out over the following couple of years. So I appreciate that's not a quick process. I hope the members understand the nature of procurement. It has to be done in a formal way, but just to reassure Dr Allen and Mr Gibson that we are absolutely taking that forward as a high priority. A number of members have talked about CalMac, and I think for balance, Presiding Officer, I would like to just say this. During the last 12 months, CalMac has picked up some of the most prestigious awards. In 2018, winning the Ferry Operator of the Year in the National Transport Awards. In customer service, and Mr Gibson referred to this, the company Customer Service Centre was the first company in the UK to be measured against and awarded the new global accreditation standard by the Contact Centre Association. And indeed, the CCA assessor highlighted a number of strengths in the team, describing it as competent, well-managed, highly customer-focused operation. So I think, and this is reflected in Labour's amendment as well, we should never lose sight of the fact that the hard-working team that works at CalMac and indeed at Northlink as well provide an excellent service. And on Northlink, over the 9-month period from January to September of this year, 97.2% of Serco Northlink passengers surveyed rated the service as excellent or good. And surely to goodness in this chamber we should reflect when actual practice is delivered, and rather than criticising services as seems to be the case today. Jamie Green, in his opening remarks, I didn't have time to address this earlier. I think it's simply wrong to say that where pressure is greatest, he was pointing to the winter months as being the point of greatest pressure on the network. That's simply not true. Greatest pressure is during the summer months when passenger numbers soar and indeed are fuelled by RET, as others have noted, and there's the greatest period of overstretch. So actually this is the time of year when it's deemed to be most convenient to do the annual maintenance schedule. He is also wrong in terms of his interpretation of the data that I quoted. Just to re-emphasise the point, we're talking about 0.6% of all passenger, all journeys, all trips that have been cancelled due to technical reasons, and I think he slightly misinterpreted the figures I was saying earlier on. And also in respect of Aaron, I think, and Mr Gibson will know well, the difficulties of the solution he was proposing to tackle Aaron, I think, displayed he didn't really understand the issues there in terms of the different vessels, different routes and conditions, and indeed I'd rather leave it to the ship's masters to decide what's the suitable solution in that situation. But in terms of points that others have made, Jamie Halker-Johnston and Colin Smith referred to RET. Just to emphasise the point, I didn't get the chance to intervene on Mr Halker-Johnston, but that just to make the point that we cannot implement RET at present, although it is still our policy to do so. There's an outstanding state aid complaint on the matter. I would hope members would understand we cannot force forward RET in the absence of a decision from the European Commission. And I think, unfortunately, the Tories are just playing games on that matter here. In terms of the internal ferry services, which have been raised by members Mr MacArthur and Mr Halker-Johnston, just point out for Mr Halker-Johnston's benefit in particular, the Tories are responsible for the situation that has arisen in the Isles, because it was under the Conservative administration back in the 1980s that the decision was taken to carve them out and have a separate arrangement. We have... and ironically, given the context of Brexit, it was to attract European funding. Of course, I'll take an intervention from the member.
Mr Halker-Johnston.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm used to coming to this chamber and having backbench SNP members blaming us for absolutely everything going back many, many years. But the Minister is aware that you've been in power and responsible for transport in Scotland for 12 years. Are you seriously suggesting? Because I can assure you that will not have any response in the islands.
Minister.
It's a tremendously interesting contribution. All I'm pointing out is the point that the member made about the difficult situation the Isles find themselves in is because of the Conservative ministers in the 80s that put them in that place. And I should actually also mention, just to bring our colleagues and Liberal Democrats into it, two transport ministers, as Kenneth Gibson highlighted, not only didn't invest in vessels to this extent, but they also took no action to address the situation. It's this government that is working with This government is working with the island authorities to try and address the long-term issue here, and we are working through a working group to develop the business case. Orkney Islands Council are keen to transfer services, Shetland Islands Council are not, they wish to retain services, and we're looking to help them in terms of investment in the internal ferry routes. In terms of the points I made, Rhoda Grant, in terms of the points made about Loch Seaforth, it is our most fastest and most reliable vessel. Yes, there was an incident she refers to, but I would hope she would recognise that vessel has done extremely good service for the communities of the Western Isles since it's entered service. And of course, we're looking at how we can adapt service provision to address the capacity issues she's referred to. But Loch Seaforth is a good addition to the fleet and is performing sterling service for the Western Isles. And indeed, John Finney makes some, just in closing, Presiding Officer, makes some excellent points about the history of trust ports and the degree to which privatisation of ports has had a bearing on our need to invest in ports, and indeed the importance of lifeline ferry service and the lack of investment between 2001 and 2011. I appreciate we cover part of that period as well. We are trying to address the long-term need to reinvest in our fleet, and I give assurance to members that is very much on our plans, and the ferries plan is well under development, as I say, looking at options to invest in our fleet. So it's been a good debate, it's been an interesting debate, but I certainly would encourage members to recognise the tremendous progress that's been made this year, and Audit Scotland indeed in their follow-up report in September indicated exactly that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I call on Donald Cameron to close the Conservatives. 7 minutes, Mr Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to again be able to contribute to this very important issue as it affects so many of my constituents across the Highlands and Islands. I say again because we have debated ferries several times recently, and it is hugely regrettable that we have to revisit an issue that is fast becoming a scandal that should shame the Scottish Government. Like my colleagues before me, I want to focus on some specific issues as well as the broader discussion. For too long, people across the Highlands and Islands and other parts of Scotland have endured a ferry service that is wholly unreliable and has little flexibility built into it. As my colleague Jamie Green noted in his remarks and in our motion today, 82,000 delays and cancellations have occurred since 2007. That, Deputy Presiding Officer, is a lamentable statistic and one that should concern everyone in this chamber, not least because over 100,000 people who live on our island communities rely on these services to connect to the mainland. They are a lifeline service for local people. They are vital for many businesses to transport goods they are the main mode of transport used by tourists to visit our islands. And yet, despite the clear need and demand for a reliable and robust ferry network, this SNP government has failed miserably to rise to the challenge. And there are many reasons why they have failed to do so, and we still see innumerable problems with our service. I've made this point in the past, but it is worth noting again that CalMac stated in its submission to the previous ferry review in 2010 that the government would have to build a new ferry every year just to stand still. Yet we are now faced with a situation where 2 new ferries that are on order are in limbo, and if they are completed, they will definitely be late and almost certainly over budget. Of the existing fleet, almost 50% of it is beyond its 25-year life expectancy, meaning they are at significant risk of mechanical failures and breakdowns. And despite repeated warnings over a number of years, this SNP government has failed to act, and we are now in the midst of a ferry crisis. Because at the end of the day, presiding officer, it is our residents, communities and businesses that suffer. From the young woman trying to catch the ferry from Dunoon to see her sick parent in Glasgow, or a dairy farmer from Butte trying to get his produce to a processor on the mainland, or a local hotelier on Lewis who has to cancel bookings because the only ferry service is oversubscribed. These are just some examples, and there are many, of some of the cases I have dealt with since becoming an MSP. And often there is little that I can do because despite warm words from various ministers over the years, people see little material difference to many of our ferry service. In fact, some are getting worse. One issue that dominates my postbag since my election is the Dunoon to Guruk town centre ferry service. Many people remain unhappy that this service never underwent a full tendering process after the contract with our Gulf ferries expired. Many people are unhappy that the same unreliable vessels are still being used to this day. And despite it being the newest service now on CalMac's books, it is the single worst performing service with 995 cancelled sailings between January and September this year. That's almost 1,000 cancellations in 9 months. In fact, this has accounted for more than a quarter of all of CalMac's cancelled sailings so far this year.
Minister.
Can I just ask him to reflect the fact that...
Don't think your microphone's on.
Sorry, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. It's still not on? There we go.
I've had to move desk, but thank you. There's been over 3% increase in passenger traffic this year, which I hope the member would have an interest in and be welcoming. But also just reflect, he will know well that the Guruk Dunoon service, which we have set out plans to invest in, suffers badly from the vessels not being ideally suited to the conditions, and I fully acknowledge that. That's not ideal, but we are committed to addressing that. But weather-related matters are a large part of the cancellations on the Guruk Dunoon route.
Donald Cameron.
Well, what I would respond to that, presiding officer, is that even if these are weather-related, that doesn't excuse the fact that cancellations and delays are increasing. And not only that, but the MV Argyle Flower on that route has cost more in breakdown repairs than it costs to purchase the vessel, with the MV Alicat not far behind. And as others have mentioned, the Guruk link span has been out of action due to a fault, and that's had knock-on effects for other services. And it's therefore very easy to understand why people in Dunoon and the Cowal Peninsula are so exasperated with this service. Another example which has been raised with me on several occasions is the issue of overcapacity on the Stornoway to Ullapool service. Many local residents on Lewis are forced to plan ahead and book spaces on this service due to having to travel to the mainland due to space being booked up well in advance. But even visitors struggle to book onto that ferry, such as the demand during peak season. One constituent who runs a local hotel on the west side of Lewis told me she regularly has bookings cancelled due to people being unable to get on board the ferry, meaning a significant loss of income. These are merely 2 examples out of a catalogue of failings. In closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, I do want to turn to some of the remarks made by colleagues around the Chamber. One aspect of the Minister's speech and others is the fact that we all recognise and thank the staff of our ferry services for their contribution. In my experience, the staff of CalMac, the ferries that I travel on most often, are always highly professional. But Liam Kerr was amongst others who cited Audit Scotland's report and said there is no Scotland-wide long-term strategy. And that, for me, is the question that the Minister should reflect on most of all. I listened to Alistair Allen speak about tunnels. I think that is and interesting. It's becoming talked about more and more. But I have to say I was very disappointed to hear him question the good faith of these benches in raising the issue of ferries. Several of us represent the Highlands and Islands. Several of us represent the west of Scotland. Several of us represent the North East, and we are just as entitled to raise issues about ferries as he is. And I have to say, presiding officer, I listened with amazement to Kenneth Gibson, and in fact the Minister, seeming to blame everyone else, the Liberal Democrat Transport Minister, Chris Grayling, the Labour Party, everyone else except the very government who's run our ferry system for the last 12 years. And so to conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, we are in the midst of a significant ferry crisis. Our ferry network has been badly let down by an SNP government. It is ageing, it is inflexible and unreliable, and local people are fed up of excuses. They want real action, and I hope the members support our motion today.
Thank you. Thank you. That concludes the debate on the resilience. Point of order.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I seek your guidance in relation to what appeared to be misleading statements issued both by Kenneth Gibson and latterly by the Minister in relation to the procurement of vessels for the Northern Isles.
Can I stop you right here, because I'm one of these people where I will tell you that's not a point of order. Where there is a statement with which you disagree, you can check the OR and bring that can be brought up at another time, but it's not a point of order. I'm not responsible for what members are saying.
You haven't heard the point of order?
You said a misleading statement.
Well, there was a misleading statement, and there's no way of allowing the record to be rectified.
It's not a point of order. It's not for me what members are saying here. They're responsible for what they say. You must raise it again. You can check the OR and bring it up again, but you can't. It's not a point of order. I know there's been a practice of letting people do this, but it's not a point of order.
Can I ask, Deputy Presiding Officer, will this be a consistent ruling applied by the
I'm telling you what I have said. I am not declared to take this any further. It's just not a point of order. End of story. Please sit down.
Right. Now,
where was I now? I've completely lost what I was doing. Yes, that concludes the debate on the resilience of Scotland's ferry network, and we must move on to the next item of business. And that is, and I'll let members take their seats. I don't want to waste time because there'll be interventions in this debate.